Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Tamar Kharatishvili, and I am the Daniel F. and Ada L. Rice Research Fellow in Modern Art. And with Caitlin Haskell and Alive Piliado Santana, I am one of the co-curators of Frida Kahlo's Month in Paris, A Friendship with Mary Reynolds. I am delighted to welcome you to this program, held today in conjunction with the exhibition and made possible by the Frank J. Mooney Memorial Fund. As we begin, a brief reminder to please silence your mobile devices. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce the speaker for this afternoon's program, Paul B. Franklin. Based in Paris and Serres, Paul B. Franklin is an American art historian and a leading expert on the life and work of Marcel Duchamp. From 2000 to 2016, he was editor-in-chief of the scholarly journal Étant donné Marcel Duchamp, one of the most highly regarded publications devoted to the artist and his oeuvre. In addition to lecturing and publishing widely on Duchamp, he worked for numerous years with the artist's heirs, assisting with the management of his estate. More recently, Franklin has devoted his time to curating exhibitions, including Brancusi and Duchamp, The Art of Dialogue, and Matisse in Black and White, both presented in New York, and Please Touch, Marcel Duchamp and the Fetish, shown in London and Paris. His most recent curatorial project, Marcel Duchamp and the Lure of the Copy, took place in 2023 and 24 at the Peggy Guggenheim Collection in Venice. Franklin received his PhD in the history of art and architecture from Harvard University in 1999. In 2019, he was elected to the Swedish Royal Academy of Fine Arts. Now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Paul to the stage.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. When Marcel Duchamp left war-torn Paris for New York in June 1915, his reputation had preceded him. In early 1913, in fact, his painting, Nude Descending a Staircase, had sparked a nationwide outcry when it was shown in the International Exhibition of Modern Art, commonly known as the Armory Show, which opened in New York and subsequently traveled to Chicago and Boston. Criticized and caricatured, this abstract, machine-like portrayal of the female form both flummoxed and infuriated American audiences. Given Duchamp's notoriety, soon after his arrival in New York, local journalists jockeyed to interview him. In the pages of the New York Tribune in September 1915, for example, the artist extolled the virtues of the feminine sex in the United States. Quote, "The American woman is the most intelligent woman in the world today. The only one who always knows what she wants and therefore always gets it." End quote. About 8 years later, the cerebral, sometimes inscrutable, and often aloof Marcel Duchamp fell head over heels for one such American woman in the person of Mary Reynolds. Henri-Pierre Rocher, one of Duchamp's closest friends, witnessed the initial blossoming of this love affair. On July 3rd, 1924, he acknowledged in his diary, quote, "As a butterfly goes to certain flowers, so Marcel makes a beeline for beauty. He couldn't fail to be drawn to Mary." End quote. From late 1923 or early 1924, when they commenced their relationship, until the unexpected death of Reynolds in September 1950, she and Duchamp were a couple. But who was Mary Reynolds? While scholars systematically mention her in discussions of Duchamp's life, they usually do so only in passing, and rarely in reference to either his work or hers. In what follows, I will explore the aesthetic dialogues that Reynolds and Duchamp initiated across their respective oeuvres. By placing their unique creations in conversation with one another, I will illustrate how love, as much as aesthetics, nourished their art, especially those objects that they created collaboratively. Mary Louise Hubacek was born on October 19, 1891, into a Protestant family in Minneapolis. She was the elder of 2 children. Her father was a lawyer, and her younger brother, Frank Brooks Hubacek, followed in his footsteps. After graduating from Vassar College in 1913, Mary enrolled in graduate school at the University of Minnesota, where she met Matthew Reynolds. They relocated to Manhattan in 1915 and married the following year. Soon after the United States entered World War I, Matthew Reynolds enlisted in the Army. He managed to survive the trenches, but died of influenza on January 5, 1919, in Luxembourg. While her husband was on the battlefield, Reynolds had an affair with Lawrence Vail, a French-born American writer and the future husband of Peggy Guggenheim. He recorded details of their relationship in his unpublished autobiography. Quote, "She was so easy to be with, and also entertaining. I liked the way she talked and gossiped, the teasing, the quaint little jokes, the wicked twinkle in her eye when she made malicious remarks about most of the people we knew in the village. She had a graceful awkwardness, like a girl in a picture by Cranach," end quote. One day in 1917 or 1918, during an outing in Greenwich Village, Lawrence Vail pointed out Duchamp to Reynolds. Unwilling to yield to parental pressure to remarry and start a family, and eager to escape her middle-class Midwestern roots, the free-spirited Reynolds set sail for Italy in spring 1921, intending to study art. After 6 months in Rome, she visited Paris and settled there permanently in March 1923. Even though she lived near the Eiffel Tower, Reynolds spent most of her time in Montparnasse, which was the artistic and literary epicenter of the French capital. She survived thanks to her husband's modest military pension and regular funds from her father. In Montparnasse, she reconnected with Lawrence Vail, who introduced her to the American writer Juna Barnes and to Peggy Guggenheim, the American heiress and future art collector who became one of her best friends. Guggenheim later recalled, quote, "Mary was dark with a beautiful figure. She was tall and elegant and had soft eyes. Her widow's peak was her great attraction. She was the only person in Bohemia with any money, and yet she was always broke because she lent it or gave it away the minute it arrived from America," end quote. Generous, affable, charismatic, and carefree, Reynolds had a penchant for smoking, dancing, and drinking, and quickly became a local fixture in Montparnasse. In addition to Barnes and Guggenheim, she counted among her friends an extensive coterie of artists, writers, and musicians, many of whom were queer. These included Samuel Beckett, Kay Boyle, Constantine Brancusi, Alexander Calder, Jean Cocteau, the lesbian couple Janet Flanner and Salida Solano, James Joyce, Man Ray, Virgil Thompson, and the menage a trois Glenway Westcott, Monroe Wheeler, and George Platt Lynes. Virgil Thompson crowned Reynolds, quote, the queen of American Montparnasse, end quote. Another neighborhood resident aptly described her as, quote, the girl with the Mona Lisa smile, end quote. Looking back on her first decade in Paris, Reynolds proudly admitted in 1934, quote, I had a good time, end quote. Keen on perfecting her French, sometime between the summer of 1923 and early 1924, Reynolds hired Duchamp to give her language lessons. Their romance began soon thereafter. With her slim physique and closely cropped hair, the independent, cigarette-smoking, shy but hedonist Reynolds resembled a new woman, that sexy, liberated type who captured Duchamp's attention when he arrived in New York in June 1915. The first few years that Duchamp and Reynolds spent together were turbulent ones, due to his jealous attempt to guard his freedom and keep their love affair a secret. By the 1920s, however, the couple settled into a comfortable domestic existence. The complicity they shared is beautifully revealed in a short film that Brancusi made in his studio in 1930, when he inaugurated the new fireplace that he had designed and constructed. And here is the silent film. You can see on the right, Vera Moore, who was a pianist from New Zealand who was Brancusi's lover, lighting the fire, this is the fireplace, as Mary Reynolds and Duchamp look on. Brancusi steps in the scene, serves himself a drink, and they all toast one another. My favorite moment is the way that Brancusi roughly but affectionately runs his hand through Mary's hair, and she doesn't even notice. Since her youth, Reynolds displayed a passion for books. Around 1916, she conceived her own bookplate in the form of a woodblock print, which displays her name amid a sunny landscape. She replicated the print in a rainbow of colors and on different papers, illustrating her early sensitivity to design and aesthetics. In 1929, like several women of her generation, Reynolds took up bookbinding. To learn the craft, she apprenticed with Pierre Legrand. Celebrated for his distinctly modern Art Deco bindings, Legrand was also a highly sought-after interior decorator and furniture maker. He counted Jacques Doucet, the rich French fashion designer and art collector, as one of his most important clients. Beginning in 1923, Jacques Doucet collected Duchamp's work, and Duchamp almost certainly introduced Reynolds to Pierre Legrand, thanks to Doucet. Reynolds made a name for herself with her inventive creations and non-traditional methods of fabrication. Her bindings often featured atypical materials, like women's leather gloves, the handle of a teacup, or untrimmed toad skins. Pierre Legrand had done similar, if less adventuresome things with certain of his bindings, like the one shown here, the covers of which include mother of pearl juxtaposed with crushed eggshells. In autumn 1932, Reynolds began renting a house at 24 Rue Hallé in southern Paris, where she set up a bookbinding studio. In the mid-1930s, she had a business card printed, on which she publicly announced her craft. The French word reliure translates as bookbinding. While Reynolds initially may have intended to work professionally, her talent and enthusiasm for bookbinding ultimately remained a private affair, as her niece, Marjorie Watkins, recalled, quote, "I remember so well that she never wanted to commercialize her bindings," end quote. In fact, nearly all the books that Reynolds bound were gifts from or to her artist and writer friends. As word of her talent spread, many of these same individuals solicited her to bind their personal copies of the books that they had written or illustrated. The everyday items that Reynolds integrated into certain of her bindings echo Duchamp's ready-mades. Those mundane, manufactured objects which he acquired beginning in the 1910s and isolated from their utilitarian context, so as to exclude both the hand of the artist and personal taste from the creative process. Certain of Reynolds's bindings also resonate with some of the singular, often enigmatic objects that Duchamp cobbled together using ready-made elements. One of these is Why Not Sneeze, Rose c'est la vie. The curious title refers to the drag persona that Duchamp adopted in 1920. Rose c'est la vie being a pun on Eros c'est la vie, or Eros, that's life. Inside a metal birdcage, he assembled pieces of prefabricated marble that resemble sugar cubes. Available in hardware stores at the time, these small stone blocks were placed inside tea kettles to prevent the buildup of limescale deposits while heating water. When one lifts the object, the light airiness traditionally associated with birds and flight gives way to the surprising sensation of extreme weight, since marble is far denser than sugar. Duchamp reiterated the contradictions between visual and tactile perception thanks to the glass thermometer that he nestled among the marble cubes. Ironically, this medical instrument, which customarily is employed to detect fevers, is rendered useless, given the inert coldness of marble. The thermometer also alludes to the title of the artwork, since sneezing is a frequent physiological reaction to sudden drops in air temperature. Furthermore, sneezing is a telltale indicator of the common cold, which can precipitate the temporary loss of smell and taste. Finally, the loss of bodily control when one sneezes can be likened to the sexual release of orgasm, which is precipitated by an increase in body temperature, as hinted at in the thermometer. Why Not Sneeze, Rose c'est la vie is a whimsical meditation on the human senses, as well as a direct interrogation of the predominance that we as viewers ascribe to the visual when interacting with art. Duchamp's friend, Henri-Pierre Rocher, owned Why Not Sneeze, Rose c'est la vie until 1937. Reynolds undoubtedly was familiar with the object, since she too was close to Rocher, and even fashioned a few bookbindings for him. Reynolds glossed Duchamp's object in her design for the book Un rude hiver, or A Hard Winter, a 1939 novel by the French writer Raymond Queneau. This autobiographical tale chronicles the chance encounters during World War I between the main character, a wounded and widowed soldier, and various women and girls, with whom he develops complex ties of desire and affection. Into the spine of her binding, Reynolds embedded a glass thermometer, which signaled quite literally the frigid seasonal setting of the narrative, and more metaphorically, the amiable and erotic sentiments between the characters, which fluctuated and were not necessarily reciprocal. She underscored this all too familiar reality on the inside covers of the volume, where she placed opposing bands of red and blue leather, exactly like the colors on a water faucet that indicate hot and cold. The creative exchanges between Duchamp and Reynolds were often infused with humor of a sexual tenor. Two works that they conceived in close proximity to one another perfectly embody this playfulness, offering complementary parodies of masculinity. One of Duchamp's favorite authors was the French writer Alfred Jarry, who died in 1907 and was the forefather of the theater of the absurd. In 1935, Duchamp and Reynolds collaborated on one particular binding for Jarry's famous play Ubu Roi, or King Ubu, which Reynolds executed in at least 3 examples. In the late 1940s, she conceived another binding for Jarry's last novel, titled Le Surmâle, or The Supermale. In the opening line of the book, the male protagonist rather brashly asserts, quote, "The act of love is of no importance, since it can be performed indefinitely," end quote. The irreverent, darkly humorous plot revolves around male sexual potency, mirrored in spectacular feats of athleticism. In her design, Reynolds fixed a metal corset stay to the base of the book's spine. Associated with women's attire, this flexible item is at once phallic and feminine, rigid and pliable, a spoof that parallels Jarry's own satire of hypermasculinity. Reynolds extended her burlesque of virility with the piece of leather that she laid over the corset stay. Cut in the form of 2 wings, it evokes images of butterflies, pixies, even fairies, all stereotypes of effeminacy and male homosexuality. A few years after she created this binding, Duchamp fashioned his sculpture titled Objet d'art. Both a verbal and visual pun, this copper electroplated plaster cast resembles the male sexual organ. In French, objet d'art is a homophone of objet d'art, or art object, while dard, D-A-R-D, which translates as dart, is French slang for penis. Duchamp ironically sapped his penile artwork of its masculine vigor by conceiving it to lie entirely flat. Incapable of standing erect, objet d'art remains forever flaccid. Moreover, this feeble phallus has feminine origins. Inverting the narrative of the book of Genesis, in which God created Eve from a rib of Adam, Duchamp extracted the plaster morsel that became objet d'art from the breast area of a model of a nude female figure on which he was secretly working at the time. Reynolds subtly suggested her romantic relationship with Duchamp in a binding that she created for Jean Cocteau's 1941 play La Machine à écrire, or The Typewriter. Written during World War II, when denunciations were commonplace, the plot unfolds in a provincial French town whose inhabitants are plagued by anonymous typed letters, threatening to expose the intimate secrets of each household. Part psychological thriller, part detective story, Cocteau's text focuses on the ambiguous bonds between members of one particular family, which includes twin brothers. In her radically simple yet ingenious binding, Reynolds adorned the cover boards with 2 sheets of ordinary paper, across which the uppercase letter M was repeatedly and randomly typed in either black or red ink. At first glance, this letter is a shorthand reference to the French title of the play, Machine à écrire. The black and red duo, however, also alludes to the twins in the play, one of whom is suspected of being the author of the anonymous letters. Finally, on a far more personal level, the multiple M's in 2 colors suggest Reynolds and Duchamp, whose own names, Mary and Marcel, both commence with M. In the 1910s, Duchamp utilized a typewriter to make certain artworks, a relative rarity at the time. He also purchased an Underwood typewriter cover in 1916 and declared it a ready-made. This object went missing soon thereafter, and Duchamp publicly acknowledged its existence for the first time in 1941, at virtually the same moment that Reynolds bound Cocteau's play. From the mid-1930s to the early 1940s, in addition to their design for Alfred Jarry's King Ubu, Reynolds and Duchamp collaborated on a handful of other bindings. In February 1936, Duchamp informed his friend, the American art dealer Julian Levy, quote, "Mary and I are going to London for a show of bookbindings made by Mary. If you have any clients for bookbindings, more or less deluxe, let us know. I might design a cover if the book appeals to me," end quote. In the late 1930s, Duchamp conceived and Reynolds executed a binding for Hebdomeros, a surrealist dream novel by the Italian artist Giorgio de Chirico. On the front and back covers, the title and author's name recede from the spine in perspective. The spine, in fact, functions as a kind of magical mirror, projecting de Chirico's name backward and in reverse black lettering, rather than the white letters that compose the title. Duchamp had previously utilized this typographical formula, initially in the title for his silent film Anemic Cinema, which explores the hypnotic and erotic effects of optics, and subsequently on the covers of his 1932 chess treatise titled opposition and sister squares are reconciled. Duchamp and Brancusi had perfected the cover design for the latter publication in September 1931, while vacationing with Reynolds in a villa that she had rented on the French Riviera. With his camera, Brancusi documented both the project and his intimate friendship with the couple. The binding for Hebdomeros, as well as the slipcase that Reynolds constructed for it, which she embellished with colorful bands of paper, call to mind Duchamp's last oil painting. Realized in 1918 and bizarrely titled Tombe, this composition features shadows of his ready-mades alongside multiple color swatches that overlap and recede in space. Around 1935, Duchamp offered Reynolds several color trial proofs of his artwork titled Corolle, an optical disc that he had drawn for his film Anemic Cinema. These proofs were part of a much larger group, recently rediscovered, which had been printed in preparation for his cover design for the December 1934 issue of the Surrealist journal Minotaur. Reynolds eventually employed these illustrations as end papers in 2 bindings. The 1932 English edition of Night Flight by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry and the 1944 book Loin de Rouille, or Far from Rouille, by Raymond Queneau. The geometric logo of Crosby Continental Editions, the publisher of Night Flight, resembles Duchamp's optical disc, while Queneau's story unfolds against the backdrop of cinema, the same venue for which Duchamp initially created Corolle. These visual and thematic similarities may have motivated Reynolds to select the trial proofs of Duchamp's optical disc as the end papers for her 2 books. During the very same period that Duchamp and Reynolds joined creative forces to produce several bindings, Duchamp was busy realizing an elaborate project of his own, for which her expertise as a bookbinder proved indispensable. Between 1935 and 1941, Duchamp labored intensively to fabricate reproductions and miniature replicas of 69 of his most important artworks, to be housed together in a portable container. He intended to issue this compilation, commonly known as the box in a valise, in a limited edition. In autumn 1940, as he was preparing to assemble the first copies, he realized that the box that he had designed was too fragile and unstable. Duchamp turned to Reynolds for help. Together, they conceived a new outer suitcase in leather, with a back wall that folded down flat, and to which the lid remained attached, mimicking the double hinges of the spine of a book, which permit the articulation of the covers. In recognition of Reynolds' assistance and of his affection for her, Duchamp presented Reynolds with one of the very first copies of his redesigned box in a valise. Soon after devising this solution, Reynolds paid homage to Duchamp's valise in one of her bindings. As previously mentioned, Duchamp had adopted the drag persona Eros c'est la vie in 1920. Dolled up in makeup, baubles, and a stylish hat, she epitomized a bourgeois belle. As classy and seductive as many cisgender women, Eros C'est la Vie was also sassy and brainy, forging her own career by publishing salacious puns and spoonerisms, making movies, and co-authoring several artworks with Duchamp. One of these was The Box in a Valise, the official title of which is From or by Marcel Duchamp or Eros C'est la Vie. In 1939, Duchamp collected his puns and spoonerisms and printed them under the title Eros C'est la Vie. When Reynolds decided to bind her personal copy, Duchamp gave her 2 cast-off pieces of gray cardboard on which trial impressions of the title of The Box in a Valise had been stamped using a letterpress block. She mounted the 2 boards on the front and back covers, punched holes at each corner, and framed them in humble twine. For the end papers, Reynolds drew an ant, mosquito, and leaf insect over stenciled fern fronds. The twine and insects both call to mind Duchamp's celebrated spiderweb-like installation of string for the group exhibition First Papers of Surrealism, which was held in New York in autumn 1942. The bookbinding activities of Reynolds guided Duchamp again when he undertook his last major work, which he realized in secret from 1946 to 1966. Titled Étant donné, or Given, this 3-dimensional assemblage depicts a reclining nude female mannequin in a landscape. Hidden behind a partition, the provocative diorama is only visible through 2 peepholes that Duchamp bore into a wooden door. The artwork initially emanated from a fiery love affair that Duchamp had between 1943 and 1950 with the Brazilian sculptor Maria Martins, whose husband was the Brazilian ambassador to the United States. The female mannequin at the center of Étant donné was cast directly from the body of Maria Martins and subsequently covered in parchment, the properties of which Duchamp would have known thanks to Reynolds's bookbinding activities. Even though Duchamp's liaison with Maria Martins largely determined Étant donné, Reynolds too figured prominently, if symbolically, in the artwork. From late July to early September 1946, Duchamp and Reynolds took a trip that had a decisive impact on the conception of Étant donné. At the invitation of Hélène and Henri Oppenau, a French couple in Bern, they sojourned in Switzerland, where Henri Oppenau was the French ambassador. Reynolds had met the diplomatic couple in New York in spring 1943, shortly after she escaped occupied France, where she had served with their daughter, Violaine, in the French resistance. At the time, Henri Oppenau represented the provisional government of the French Republic in Washington. The Oppenaus adored Reynolds, and Hélène became one of her best friends. Soon after their introduction in New York, Reynolds presented the couple to Duchamp, and the 4 of them socialized regularly. Thanks to the Washington diplomatic circuit, the Oppenaus also knew Maria Martins and her husband. In her diary, on February 20th, 1944, Hélène Oppenau prudishly dismissed the work of Duchamp's new lover. Quote, dinner with the Martinses at the Brazilian embassy. Maria is a sculptor and creates works where mammary glands of every dimension spring from all sides. Obsession with breasts, end quote. Thanks to Hélène Oppenau's diary, we know that Reynolds was fully aware of Duchamp's affair with the Brazilian artist, which at moments deeply distressed her. On September 7th, 1947, for example, Hélène Oppenau reported, quote, "Mary is hardly cheerful, and I sense that her instability comes from what she calls Marcel's desertion. She has learned that Marcel has been seeing a lot of Maria Martins. It's Maria's extreme animalism that attracts the 100% intellectual who is Marcel Duchamp," end quote. Through diplomatic channels, Henri Oppenau obtained a visa for Reynolds in spring 1945 so she could return to Paris. At the same moment, he was named ambassador to Switzerland. Duchamp followed Reynolds back to Paris in May 1946, and the Oppenaus suggested that they spend their summer vacation in Switzerland. After several days with their host in Bern, Duchamp and Reynolds traveled to Chèvre, a Swiss village nestled atop a steep, rocky landscape dotted with vineyards and overlooking Lake Geneva. On Hélène Oppenau's recommendation, they rented a room at the nearby Hotel Bellevue, where they stayed from August 5th to August 9th. Situated along a cliff road, the Hotel Bellevue offered a breathtaking panorama across Lake Geneva onto the Alps. Duchamp, however, preferred the crashing waterfall visible from the other side of the Hotel Bellevue. Known as the Forstay, this cascade flows down a ravine that separates Chèvre from the neighboring village of Puydou. Before leaving the Hotel Bellevue, Duchamp took a series of photographs of the waterfall and the craggy terrain around it. He later used these images to make the landscape backdrop of Étant Donné. The trip that Reynolds and Duchamp took to Switzerland in the summer of 1946 was their last vacation as a couple. In 1947, Duchamp settled permanently in New York, where his relationship with Martins intensified. On May 27, 1947, Reynolds lamented to a friend, quote, "Marcel is wedded to New York instead of to me," end quote. Despite the distance that developed between them, when Reynolds fell seriously ill in spring 1950, Duchamp became very concerned. As her health deteriorated, Frank Brooks Hubachek asked Duchamp to return to Paris to be with his ailing sister. Duchamp did so and was at Reynolds' side on September 30th, 1950, when she died of uterine cancer. The loss was painful and ignited his anger, as he confessed to Man Ray in November, quote, "The same thought of rage that I've had ever since the beginning of her illness haunts me now. Since she herself, in a kind of unconscious suicide, refused all surgical procedures, when perhaps there would still have been time. Nothing like a single death to bring home the damned stupidity of the rest of humankind," end quote. After Reynolds' passing, Duchamp remained in Paris for 2 months, living in her house. He settled her affairs and shipped her possessions to her brother here in Chicago, keeping only 3 mementos for himself: 2 unfinished bindings for books by Alfred Jarry, and an ornate silver necklace made by Calder, whom Reynolds had introduced to Duchamp in 1931. The emotional toil was intense, compounded by the fact that Maria Martins had abandoned Duchamp several months earlier, returning to Brazil with her retired husband and children. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Duchamp wrote to her from Paris on November 19, 1950, quote, "Everything seems to be more and more tangled, and I'm almost suffering physically from my stay here," end quote. From summer 1938 until her death, Reynolds rented a charming house at 14 Rue Hallé, a quiet street in southern Paris. It was here that Frida Kahlo convalesced in February and March 1939, after getting sick during her first and only voyage to Paris. Over the years, Duchamp and Reynolds decorated the interior in a highly personal style, which left a lasting impression on many visitors. Behind the house was a spacious and bucolic private garden, where the couple entertained countless friends and family. Virtually no photographic record of the house has resurfaced, except these few snapshots taken by the nurse who cared for Reynolds in her last days. Jean Souquet, who visited the house in summer 1949 as a young surrealist, recalled, quote, "The outdoor space seemed quite vast because the neighboring gardens weren't closed off by high walls, and further afield, a convent added to the greenery," end quote. Reynolds was deeply attached to her corner of paradise, and so was Duchamp, who spent most nights there when in Paris. He had his own room on the ground floor overlooking the street. The walls, inside door, and perhaps the ceiling of which he had papered from edge to edge with Michelin road maps. Initially, immediately after Reynolds' death, Duchamp encouraged the Openots to buy the property for their daughter and her family, assuring them in a letter, quote, "At whatever price, this house is a jewel and can easily be transformed with little money," end quote. For Duchamp, 14 Rue Hallé and its idyllic garden were laden with memories, which inevitably resurfaced as he elaborated the landscape backdrop for Étant Donné. He commenced this project in the early 1950s, only after Reynolds had died. His association of his deceased companion with Arcadian landscapes may explain the palette he chose for the backdrop. Even though he photographed the waterfall in the thick of summer, he ultimately depicted the surrounding landscape in the blistering colors of early autumn, the season of Reynolds' untimely passing. As Duchamp was methodically constructing the backdrop for Étant Donné, he was also working closely with the Art Institute of Chicago and Reynolds' brother to catalog her library and bindings, which the latter had donated to the museum. Duchamp designed the bookplate for the collection in 1951, which featured a profile portrait of Reynolds, wearing monogrammed earrings that Calder had made for her. He also supervised the layout of the catalog, which was finally published in 1956. A year later, Duchamp revisited his bookplate in a strikingly similar self-portrait, which was incorporated into another book that he had designed, the first catalogue raisonné of his life's work. In the introduction that he wrote for the catalogue of Reynolds's collection, Duchamp praised his departed companion as, quote, a great figure in her modest ways, end quote. He also clarified that her collection was no collection at all, but rather the reflection of a life lived to the fullest. Quote, the assembling of these books, albums, magazines, catalogs of exhibitions, pamphlets, was not premeditated, as in the case of a formal library. It's more like a diary, the art and letters diary of Mary Louise Reynolds's 30-year life in Paris, end quote. At the request of Reynolds's brother, Duchamp contacted his old friend Jean Cocteau and asked him to contribute a drawing to the catalogue. He happily obliged and produced Tender Tribute to Mary Reynolds. Portraying two youthful figures of indeterminate sex and gender, in profile and kissing one another, the work on paper embodied Cocteau's romantic vision of Reynolds and Duchamp as an ageless, inseparable couple. After receiving a copy of the catalogue, Cocteau wrote Duchamp, proclaiming, quote, it's rare that death leaves warm ashes. Thanks to you, that's what's happening for Mary. I congratulate you and kiss you, end quote. Mary Reynolds left an indelible mark on the life and work of Marcel Duchamp. The love and compassion that fueled their many creative conversations endured even after her death. They only went silent when Duchamp himself died on October 2nd, 1968, an event that Calder memorialized in a little-known drawing that he endearingly captioned as follows, quote, M. Duchamp, born like a light, lived like a light, out like a light. And that was the delightful life of Marcel Duchamp, end quote. Without question, one of the brightest lights in Duchamp's delightful life was Mary Reynolds. Thank you.